Have you ever seen someone who you compete with regularly and you know their level of performance suddenly start going a whole lot faster? Whenever this happens, it's usually for the same reasons. So in this video, I'm going to show you what that reason is and how I've used this strategy to help rowers go from 8:03 to 7:38 on the ergo in 9 weeks, to go from 6:56 down to 6:19 in 12 months, and to take 17 seconds off their time in the single scull. And at the end, I'm going to show you how to take what you've just learned and apply it to your own rowing. And if you want to work with me directly, there is a link down below where you can find out more information. So let's start with the big problem that you have to solve if you want to get this strategy to work for you. Busy rowers often find getting faster hard because they try to copy other people. And that's almost a guaranteed fail because of the way your physiology works. You see, everyone has a different training background, different genetics, different physiology, and so they're going to respond differently to the same type of training. And this is where there's actually some inherent unfairness, because if you do the same work as someone else and train just as hard, they can still get a better result than you and even more improvement than you. But you've no doubt seen this in your own rowing, watching someone who did the same or maybe even less training than you get a superior result. And it's not because they worked harder than you, and it's not because they were tougher than you. It's because the training that they did happened to be better aligned with them and their needs. And there's only ever going to be two ways to win at that game. Option one is that you try to meet it head on with everyone else. You do the same training as everyone else, but you do it better, you do more of it, or you do it harder. But to make that work, you need to be able to add volume, you need to be dialed into your nutrition and recovery, you need to have enough spare time to add the extra sessions so that you can do more, and you need to make sure that you're not being handicapped by your technique. Or you just need to get lucky and have it turn out that the training you were doing was actually better for you than them all along. But getting lucky is not a very repeatable strategy, and in fact, hoping for luck is not a strategy at all. So ultimately, that option will fail. Option two is to use a strategy of tailoring your training specific to you so that you end up following a program that is unique and right for just you. And that is how all of the rowers I mentioned earlier were able to blow up their results and get significantly faster in what feels like a lot less time. And you do that by finding a gap. A gap is just where there's an imbalance between your strength in one area of performance versus another. We sometimes also call this bottlenecks or constraints. And when you are much weaker in one area than another, it actually acts as a brake on the entire system. And the strategy used by a lot of rowers who are able to get significantly faster in what feels like no time at all is to specifically and deliberately target the gap. But how do you find a gap? Because a lot of rowers and coaches don't realize that there are actually 5 types of gaps. And it's not just fitness or toughness or that people just need to work harder. Because that's not how performance actually works. There are different kinds of gaps, and if you don't know which one applies to you, you're going to keep training harder without ever addressing the thing that is actually holding you back. So what I'm going to do next is break down the 5 main gaps that I see in rowing, and then at the end, I'll show you how to break down what you've learned and apply it to your own rowing. Let's start with the first one. Gap 1 is the aerobic gap. This is the most common gap, and it's also the one that most rowers think they understand, but actually don't. Because the aerobic gap is not to do with being fit or unfit in objective terms, it's to do with the relationship between 2 physical qualities. The first of these is VO2 max, which is the maximum ability for your body to take in and utilize oxygen. And the other is your VL max, which is your body's maximum ability to produce power without oxygen. When you have an aerobic gap, you can produce power, but you feel the cost of it quite quickly. And typically your body isn't very good at buffering lactate, which is a byproduct of producing energy without oxygen. So for example, if you find yourself not tolerating lactate, having to vomit after high intensity sessions or feeling really nauseous, this is often a sign that you have an aerobic gap. If you have an aerobic gap, you'll also often struggle to maintain consistent pacing either across racing or erg tests. If you're a rower who finds yourself living with forever fatigue, you probably have an aerobic gap. Something common to most rowers with this issue is that they do a lot of work in the happy hurt or comfortably hard range and don't do a lot of work at low intensity training. For instance, I worked with a masters rower last year who got ChatGPT to write his training program for him, and it gave him 5 high intensity sessions per week. Because of the number of sessions, he couldn't actually do them all to a really high standard, and most of his work fell into that middle ground. Because he never did any low intensity steady state, he was never actually able to recover enough to do those sessions well. His testing showed that he had a significant aerobic gap, and by shifting away from doing so much high intensity into doing a lot more low intensity work with a small amount of really targeted training, and he took more than 17 seconds off his 2K time in the space of about 13 weeks. Now for the second gap, peak power, which is almost the polar opposite of the aerobic gap. These rowers are often aerobically very solid, and they can sustain consistent pace across racing and erg testing. They also tend to recover really well from sessions. But the first 250 meters of a race seems to feel disproportionately hard, and increases in rate don't necessarily translate into increases in speed. A lot of people with this issue, high rate is just straight up hard to get to. This is where peak power, which sets the overall ceiling on your performance, is at a relatively low level compared to the rest of your systems. It's what we term a peak power gap. And the mistake most people make here is thinking that endurance will fix it. It won't. Because it's worth considering that depending on how fit you are, you're going to be operating at a certain percentage of your maximum effort. That effort can never exceed 100%. The reality is it probably won't exceed 60%. And sometimes people even think that a peak power gap is an aerobic gap. It can sometimes be masked when it feels as though they have difficulty sustaining the intensity later in pieces or racing and thinking that it's a result of a lack of endurance. I worked with an athlete last year who was trying to get his 2K time down. He was convinced that endurance was his major issue. He had been used to doing a significant volume of training and had seen that volume decrease. He was sure that that was the reason he wasn't performing. But when we did his testing, we revealed that he actually had a peak power gap. After 2.5 weeks of targeted peak power training, he went from a 608 down to a 603. 5 weeks later, he was at a 557. He was able to take 11 seconds off his 2K time in the space of 8.5 weeks by targeting his peak power system. And the reason he had not been able to do that previously was because his peak power was too low and he was trying to operate at too high a percentage of that peak power during his 2K. More fitness was not going to solve that issue. He had a peak power gap, and the only way to address it was by targeting. The third type of gap is the anaerobic capacity gap. This is where the anaerobic system is relatively weak compared to the aerobic and peak power systems. For these rowers, their training history is almost always the smoking gun. They have often done a lot of volume over the years with a high proportion of threshold and sustainably uncomfortable work as their more intense session. Often with very little repeated bouts of maximal effort, short, ugly work, or sessions that are designed to see a fade across the session rather than trying to maintain a consistent pace. Or when they have done them, they've done them with relatively short rest periods, which means that the goal was really about survival rather than getting effective output, which is to say that they were training to avoid the very thing that is now causing a problem. This will be someone who really struggles in training between 30 to 90 seconds that often seems to get gassed really quickly. Historically, this was the type of rower who was often labeled mentally weak. In racing, they might have experienced a drop off between 500 to 1250 meters and a little bit of a rally and a sprint towards the end. But what was often mischaracterized as mental weakness or a moral failure was actually a failure of one of their key physiological systems. This is one of the most often neglected or inadequately trained areas for a lot of rowers, and is a much more common gap than a lot of coaches and rowers think. Now, before I talk about the last two gaps, if you're trying to figure out whether you have one of the first three gaps mentioned, there's a link down below where you can find the exact testing framework that I use with all of the athletes I work with, as well as a link to a free analysis tool, which is going to help you to understand which of these systems may be your gap. It's completely free, and based on recent downloads, it's been used by more than 16,000 rowers to help improve the quality of their training. Back to the video. The fourth gap type is a technical gap. Now, the fourth gap is a sneaky one because a technical gap doesn't mean that you have bad technique. Often what it looks like is inconsistency, technique that changes as soon as you try and row at full pressure, or technique that falls apart as soon as the rate comes up. The problem usually isn't awareness of what good technique looks like or what you should do or even how to perform good technique. It's typically complexity. Too many cues, too many thoughts, too much thinking about everything at once. Technical gap exists not because you have bad technique, but because it's too fragile to be able to survive contact with fatigue. And addressing this is best done by simplifying your model and focusing on doing a handful of things really, really well, rather than being a jack of all trades and master of none. Fifth gap is the strength gap, and this is one that people either completely ignore or get very wrong. A strength gap exists when you don't have enough force to apply to create the speed you want, or if you fatigue mechanically before you fatigue metabolically. Let me explain what I mean. Strength here isn't about size or aesthetics, it's about trying to make speed cheaper. So one of the most important factors in rowing is the ability to produce a lot of force and transfer it effectively to the boat. And this is why strength training is so important. You shouldn't think of it as strength training for its own sake, but rather as building the ability to produce high levels of force. If you have a strength gap, you don't have enough strength to be able to do that. And this means that you're either going to experience failure because of local muscular fatigue rather than aerobic failure, or it's going to be that you're incapable of maintaining your technique under load because you're not strong enough to maintain the positions and produce force effectively. If you have a strength gap, you will struggle to rate high, particularly on the water. Your peak power will stall even after training it, and you probably find that you have difficulty in being able to hit your UT2 splits at the right heart rate. All of these factors just mentioned can be addressed with a quality strength program that closes the strength gap. Now, here's the key part. Most rowers who hear this sort of list go ahead and do exactly the wrong thing. They start trying to fix all of these gaps at once. They add power, they add threshold, they add sprints, they start doing extra steady state work, they start trying to change things technically, and they start trying to lift like they're a powerlifter. And then they wonder why nothing really changes and they just feel mentally and physically exhausted. And the reason is because progress doesn't come from trying to deal with every single gap at once. It comes from finding the one that is acting as a brake and then targeting it deliberately. The strategy is find the gap, prioritize it, build your training around it. That's how the rowers I mentioned at the start were able to make such significant improvement. It wasn't because they trained harder than everyone else. It wasn't because they trained harder than you, but it was because their hard work was finally going in the right direction. And this is where most people get what I just said wrong. Targeting does not mean turning your whole program into one thing. It means doing 1 or 2 hard sessions per week that are focused on your biggest weakness and closing the most important gap. And everything else is designed to support it. So you're not trying to spread your effort across 5 goals. You're concentrating it on one goal and creating a framework that lets you do that. Now, if you want to be the kind of rower who gets the most from their hard work, who trains smarter without having to train like a full-time athlete, there are 2 links down below. First is to join the Personal Performance Program. This is where we do all of the work for you in building a program that is just right for you, that makes sure you know exactly what you're doing in every session, what splits and what paces to hold, and provide you with the technical analysis and the support so that you can row faster for the same effort. And if you're not ready for that, then the other link is to download the testing framework that I use with the rowers we work with, as well as a free analysis tool so that you can determine what your gap is. Or if you just love the sweet, sultry sound of my voice and want to row faster, YouTube thinks you should watch this video here, and you should probably listen to YouTube because Google knows everything about you.